Hashem, conclude the first chapter of Pirkei Avot. It may seem as if we've been doing a lot of studying only to be ready to conclude the first chapter, but I hope we have compensated in depth and uncovering diverse features and components and layers of each Mishnah, what we may have lacked in velocity in terms of forward progress. At any rate, so today we're doing chapter 18 of Perek Aleph, the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, and our subject today is the sage whose teachings we're going to consider today is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. It's interesting, all of the people we're going to discuss today are called Shimon, or nearly all of them. So we have Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. He's known as Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel II. There's also Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Hazaken, and we're talking here about generations from Hillel Hazaken, Hillel and Shammai. We learned about them a few Mishnayos ago. And then we had Shimon Beno, who was the grandson of Hillel. And then we have now Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who was a grandson of the previous Rabbi Shimon. So it can be a bit confusing, but as we find in many families, generation after generation, the sort of successor to the mantle of rabbinic leadership bore the name of his grandfather, and then his son was named for his father in turn, and that's why it can be a bit confusing. Just a couple of words about Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel II. He lived in the 2nd century, that is to say, in the generation or two after the Churban, after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And he lived in the time of the so-called Hadrianic persecutions. This was the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. He was a young man, possibly a teenager. At the time of the uprising of Bar Kokhba, he managed to survive a terrible massacre in Beitar, and he rose to prominence and maturity and became the Nasi, the leading Torah personality of the generation, as I say, in the years following the sadistic and vicious massacres that accompanied the suppression of the Bar Kokhba uprising, and the Romans were not content to just establish military superiority, but they sought to actually completely stamp out the Torah tradition. This was the time of Rabbi Akiva, or maybe the generation after, immediately after Rabbi Akiva, who of course was ultimately martyred through the Roman persecution. The relevance to this is that the society, Jewish society, was very, very weak, very endangered, very vulnerable. It wasn't clear whether Judaism would survive at all. And it was a time of such intense persecution and suffering that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel himself said that, if we were to record all of our sufferings, all of our tribulations, all of the persecutions, all of the massacres, all of the assassinations, we could never find enough papyrus or parchment in the land in which to record all of our suffering. So with that in mind, he's recorded as saying that as teaching and establishing the principle. I'm not saying he was the first one to take this view, but he is acknowledged as laying the foundations for the principle that the needs of the community take precedent over the needs or even the rights of the individual. When we talk about the threat to the survival or the well-being of the public weal, as we say, W-E-A-L, takes precedence over the needs, as I say, or even the rights of the individual. I'm thinking about the lockdown a little bit as an echo of that idea as well, where there's a fear which has sadly been partly realized already, of thousands of people dying from this contagion. Tens of thousands have already died, and it could even, in theory, have become much worse. So they have the government has forced by law all citizens to stay indoors, and people who are working have to give up their work, and people who have businesses have to abandon their businesses. Shareholders of British Air and other airline industries are feeling the pain, and this has been forced upon the society because of the needs of the society itself at large. In any case, it just occurred to me as a sort of echo of that in our own lives. With that intro, and we'll see an echo further significance of these introductory comments shortly, And let's begin to take a look at chapter 1, Mishnah 18. Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam kayam. The world endures on three things: al ha'emes, v'al hadin, v'al ha'shalom. On peace, on judgment, on justice, and on truth. Shenema, as the pasuk says, in your gates judge. In your gates judge with truth, justice, and peace. He quotes a verse in Zechariah, a pasuk from the prophet Zechariah, and we'll soon contemplate or speculate as to the significance of the fact that this is a verse expressed by the prophet Zechariah. Now, I'm sure that this Mishnah, I hope that this Mishnah brings to mind another similar Mishnah, in which we learned already. It was last year, but towards the beginning, I think it's the second Mishnah in our Perek and in our tractate. This is Shimon HaTzadik, and Shimon HaTzadik says, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omeid. The world stands on three things, and he has three different things. Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim. Torah, the divine service, and acts of kindness. So many of the commentaries wonder, is he disputing the earlier statement? Is he somehow expressing the same idea in different words? Is it not redundant? With that in mind, I saw the Torah Tamima says the whole question doesn't even begin. One sage mentioned three things upon which the earth stands. He didn't mean to say those are the only three. He chose those three that are important to him. And the other sage in our Mishnah is mentioning three other things upon which the earth stands and endures. It doesn't mean that each one excludes the others. There could be further important fundamental pillars upon which society rests. However, many of the Mefarshim want to understand what's similar and what's different in these two lists. And one observation, which I think is a very subtle and yet very compelling observation, take a close look at the Mishnah. Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam kayam. Shimon HaTzadik said, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omeid. So what's the difference between omeid, to stand, and kayam, to endure? So I saw that the Mefarshim distinguish between the two as follows. This I found in the Medrash Shmuel. We've mentioned him many times, one of the most popular and widely studied, widely reprinted, frequently reprinted compendia on Pirkei Avos, very wide-ranging as well. So in Medrash Shmuel by Rabbi Shmuel the Ozida, who lived in Tzfat in the 16th century, he was part of the circle of the followers of the Ari. He says as follows, that Shlosh Dvarim Ha'olam Omeid that we had previously, it means these are the three things for which the world was created. In other words, it was worthwhile to create the world because it was going to be established on these three principles: Torah, Avot, Gemilas Chasadim. I think these are quite well known, and most people, when they hear the idea of the world standing on three things, if they're Jewishly knowledgeable, so those three will come to mind. It's the Mishnah, as we've been discussing earlier in our chapter. What about here, Ha'olam Omeid? So, I'm sorry, Ha'olam Kayam. So, Medrash Shmuel says that Al Ha'olam Omeid that we had earlier are the things for which the world was created. It was worthwhile to create the world and to establish it upon those three pillars. Ha'olam Kayam means the world endures, the world is sustained. It means after it's been created, it can you hear me? Yeah. The world can continue to exist because of these three. That is to say, they may not be sufficient. They may not have sufficient power to justify the creation of the world, but once the world has been created, the world can keep on going with these three. He observes that Shimon HaTzadik lived during the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So things were functioning in a better way at that time. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the sage of our Mishnah, who lived about probably 150, maybe 200 years later, several generations later, after the time of the Churban, after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So he was sort of not just wondering, but he wanted to address the question, how does the world continue to exist? Yes, it was created and it was sustained initially for the purpose because of the presence of Torah, Avot, Gemilas Chasadim. But now that we have the destruction of the temple, now that our society is so weak, and now that the rabbis have been hunted down, the students of Torah are very few. So on what merit does the world continue to exist? So he says, well, we've got these three still, and these three are important, are essential to enable the world to continue at least. He gives a very simple analogy, I think is easy to understand. He says, imagine a pot of water, a large pot, and the pot of water is boiling because it has been brought to boil through the agency of a large fire. There's a raging fire underneath it, and it heats up this large volume of water, so it's boiling. Now that the water is boiling, to keep it on the boil, you don't need such a strong fire. Even if the fire is reduced from what it was, it's enough to keep it on the boil. I've observed this since I've been home a lot more than I normally am for the last couple of months. So sometimes I go into the kitchen and I see I say someone, it's either Ruthie or Yehuda. Normally Yehuda is making pasta or something like that, and there's a pot of water which is boiling, and I'm often tempted, and sometimes I turn it down, because on a lower heat it can still maintain the rolling boil which it requires. So this is how the Medrash Shmuel explains. That's why Rabban Shimon Gamliel says, on three things ha'olam kayam, the world continues to endure, even though we may not have the stronger foundations any longer, but these three that I'm going to mention are enough to keep it going. Al ha'emes, al hadin, al ha'shalom. Truth, judgment, justice, and peace. He explains as follows, that to analyze it further, it's not just that we don't have those original three, but we've got three others. He says, yes, I'm saying the Medrash Shmuel explains as follows. We do still have two of the three. We still have Torah and we still have Gemilas Chasadim, albeit notwithstanding the social breakdown of the society because of the Roman domination and persecution and the threat of idolatry and everything that goes with it. But in principle, the transmission of Torah is still possible, and acts of kindness are still possible. What about avoda? So avoda in the classic sense, of course, means service of Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash specifically, so that we don't have any longer. So he says, instead of the avoda, we need three things just to replace the avoda. According to this approach, he's not mentioning three distinct and different principles from the ones of Shimon HaTzadik, but he's rather acknowledging that two of those three we still have, but the avoda, what about the avoda? We don't have avoda anymore. How is the world sustained? So he says through the following, through din, through truth, through judgment, and through peace. And he explains as follows: the avoda, the karbonos, were of three different categories. So din refers to the sacrifices that were brought as a means of atonement. A person transgresses, so as a kapara, as a means of atonement for his or her sin, because women could bring them as well, then he or she would bring a korban chatas or a korban asham, a sin offering or a guilt offering, and that was a means of expiating the transgression. We don't have that option anymore, so instead we need din. Din is judgment, where the person who steals or who wrongs another person is brought to justice, and the dayanim hand down a judgment, and the person is either fined or punished or makes restitution, and in that way the sin is expiated. So in the absence of the korban, we have din, and din maybe even there's a formula like we say, when justice is carried out on earth, then the divine justice, the divine judgment, the divine maybe punishment does not have to be activated. This is the idea that during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, a person should do whatever he can to make his amends with other people if he has a debt which is outstanding, or even in terms of a din Torah, the Dayanim who carry out the din Torah around the days of Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, it's considered to be a very worthwhile thing to do to the extent that it's achievable, because when there's judgment, when there's justice administered on earth, then the heavenly judgment does not have to take effect, is sort of preempted in that way. So this is the din for the kaparat avon, for the atonement. MS, so he says like this, another category of the karbonos, the second category we can mention, is the category of offerings which are voluntary offerings. A person can pledge, can undertake to bring a certain type of offering. These are called nedavos, unedarim. A person takes a neder, a vow to bring a certain korban, or a person offers an indava, a donation, pledges a contribution. So he says that if a person does that and he fulfills his word, that is to say, MS, he upholds he honors his own word, so then that can take the place of the neder and the nedava. He even says if a person pledges to charity, or if a person undertakes to give to the poor, so that act of charity can take the place of pledging a korban in ancient times, in the days of the Beis Hamikdash. So al ha-din, we've said, takes the place of the sin offering. Al ha-emes, on the truth, keeping one's word, fulfilling one's pledges, so that takes the place of that other category of karbanos. And a person who gives charity, pledges to charity, and fulfills his pledge, so that takes the place of the second category of karbanos. Of course, the third category is shalom, is a korban shlamim, a peace offering, that if a person promotes, and if the society is one of peace, peace between Bein Adam lechavero, so that will induce peace between Hashem and the Jewish people as well, and this takes the place of the korban shlamim. So according to this interpretation, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is mentioning three things which collectively take the place or fulfill the idea of the avoda, which we no longer have nowadays with the absence of the Beis Hamikdash. So again, the contextualizing the personality and the sort of era of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel helps us understand and gives us an insight into his teaching in our Mishnah. And lastly, the Medrash Shmuel adds, the proof text is from Zechariah, from the prophet Zechariah, and he points out that Zechariah lived among the last generation of the prophets, or nearly the last generation of the prophets. He lived at the time of the destruction of the first temple. So Zechariah, who witnessed the Churban Habayis, so he taught this verse, meaning he is the one who, in his teachings, in his book of the prophets, we find this pasuk: Emes umishpat shalom shiftu b'sha'arechem, truth and judgment of peace administer in your gates. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who lived after the Churban of the second temple, so he reaches back to the pasuk from Zechariah, who was reflecting on how Jewish life can continue in the absence of the temple, mentioning these three. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, yes, from this pasuk in Zechariah, we can distill three principles that will enable the world to continue to endure even in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash. Taking this now a step further to analyze it more closely in terms of judgment and in terms of the workings of the Jewish courts, so Irving Bunim, who never fails to, in my experience, to reveal relevant perspectives, often drawing, by the way, on the same classic sources that I'm surveying as well, but often he has his own take and sometimes quite original material as well. So he says like this, that din, Emes, and Shalom are interrelated, unsurprisingly, and sometimes the process of judgment, which ideally includes all of them, but occasionally one or the other may have to be set aside in order to sort of prioritize one of these three. Let me explain. So he says sometimes judgment, din, justice, according to Torah law, may actually demand suspending or setting aside human intellect, seichel enushi, the human understanding, the natural evaluation of the events might lead to a certain conclusion and produce a certain judgment. And yet the din, the law of the Torah, may be different than that. And he gives a very good example of Shimon ben Shetach. I say a good example because it's quite a striking example. Shimon ben Shetach, it's interesting, he's another Shimon that we're considering in our studies this evening. So Shimon ben Shetach was one of the sages, I think his name was mentioned previously or is coming up, one of the well-known sages of the Mishnah, and he once recounted as follows. He said, may I see the consolation of Zion, which is an expression of certainty, as surely as I once saw someone pursuing another, sword in hand. The other fled into a ruin, and the pursuer after him. I followed, only to find the pursuer with the sword in his hand dripping blood, and the other thrashing about in his death agony. Said I to this man, Russia, a wicked one, who killed him? It was certainly I or you. And the implication is it wasn't I, it must have been you. But what shall I do with you when your fate is not in my hands? For the Torah has said, by the word of two witnesses or three witnesses shall he that is to die be put to death. And I'm only one. Besides which, I didn't witness the act itself. It's only circumstantial evidence, even though the circumstantial evidence is compelling beyond doubt. But for technical reasons, I cannot testify against you in a court of law or in the absence of another observer. And even I didn't actually observe the event itself. Rather let, I'm just concluding now what he said, rather let the one above who knows all thoughts exact retribution from this man. And before the man could barely move, a poisonous snake bit him and he fell dead. So the very end of the story suggests that Hashem did bring about justice for this murderer. But Shimon ben Shetach himself, probably in great frustration, was powerless in terms of the legal mechanism to bring about the execution of this murderer because he could not be convicted on the evidence that was available to him, to the observer Shimon ben Shetach. So there's an example where din actually takes precedence over emes, because when it comes to exacting punishment against a criminal. So even in ancient times when the Sanhedrin was functioning, the guidelines for bringing into effect those punishments were very strict and very rigorous, very limited, and therefore din would uh, demand that emes, that truth, be set aside because this is a law of the Torah. On the other hand, when it comes to dinei mamonus, that is to say, monetary matters where there's a dispute between two balei din, between two litigants, and there you can have a situation where the din, the law, seems to support a certain opinion, where the evidence, the documents, the witnesses, etc., seem to indicate a certain outcome, but the judge, the dayanim, are worried. They have a feeling that this judgment is faulty, that this is what's called in halacha din meruma, where there is some rama'u, there's some deception here. There's a feeling, and it may be more than a feeling, there may be compelling reason to believe that although the evidence suggests a certain outcome, this outcome actually is a distortion and a corruption of the judgment. And there, the dayanim are warned against the din meruma. And if a dayan has that feeling, if he doesn't have the confidence in handing down the law in accordance with the evidence before him, he should recuse himself, and he has the right to decline to judge this case if he feels it is din meruma. So that's why we see that's why the Mishnah says al ha din. I'm sorry, al ha emes. It must be accordance with the emes and with the din, and of course the objective of this all is shalom, is in order to achieve shalom, a peaceful outcome. I'm just looking here at my notes because I added something further. Yes, the shalom, the peace, ultimately is not only between the litigants, because sometimes the law is harsh and the outcome, the truth hurts, as we say. The outcome may not promote peaceful relations between the two litigants. Sometimes that cannot be achieved, but there's a higher type of peace which is achieved through emes and through din, and that is peace between God and the Jewish people. That is to say, when the courts of law administer justice to the very best of their ability, and even though the the society or the individuals within the society may not be satisfied with the outcome, but ultimately this is peace between Hashem and the Jewish people, in the absence of which ultimately there can be no peace at all. There's one other point of view that the or approach that the Medrash Shmuel mentions. Excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nivra. There's another approach, and he says this is that all three relate to the judicial process. All three statements about din, emes, and shalom, they all relate to the judicial process. And he says that the din means that the judges are enjoined to administer justice without any distortion, without any corruption, of course, and without any favoritism, without any, even if they want to, like Rashi says in the Torah explicitly, if a judge wants to enable a poor person to receive compensation and he will be sustained in a dignified fashion when he's litigating against a wealthy person, it's absolutely wrong to do so. If the law is on the side of the wealthy person, then that is how the law has to be handed down. So this is din. The judges are warned not to show any type of favoritism. Emes, truth, this is a warning to the witnesses, that the witnesses should testify the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That the witnesses themselves have to uphold truth and not to falsify their evidence. And shalom, which again is quite difficult, can be quite difficult to achieve, that the litigants themselves, after the judgment is handed down, there should be peace between them. There should be shalom, between one and the other, that even the one who has lost, but he should nevertheless not bear malice towards the judges or towards his adversary. The law is the law, and once it's been handed down, so shalom. Again, not always easy to achieve in this regard. Rabbeinu Yonah can often be relied upon to provide an ethical perspective. Of course, Pirkei Avos is also translated in English as Ethics of the Fathers, and frequently there is an ethical component which Rabbeinu Yonah, as I say, normally brings out. Rabbeinu Yonah is the famous author of Shaarei Tshuva. We mentioned him many times. He's one of the sources that I am turning to in my preparation for the shiur week by week. Rabbeinu Yonah lived in Girona, Rabbeinu Yonah of Girona, of Spain, or Barcelona, Catalonia, and easy to remember for that reason. He was a cousin of Ramban. He was about a generation older than Ramban as well, and very distinguished, probably the leading Torah figure of his day in Girona, until possibly Ramban surpassed him in the next generation. In any case, he says that when the Mishnah here says emes, that the world is sustained on truth as one of the pillars of the world through which the world endures, he says it doesn't mean only, like we've been saying until now, truth in the case of a din Torah, or truth rather than to corrupt or to falsify, a miscarriage of justice. He says that this means a person has to uphold the truth and speak the truth, even with regard to some matter in which it's just like recounting something which he saw, or something which he did, or something which he heard. Even bedram shel ma bekach. A person says that he went to a football match and he saw a certain goal that was scored, or he's got a signature from a certain football player, or something like that. I'm paradigm of something that's trivial and not important. Best, it doesn't harm anyone. There's no downside to someone recounting an event which maybe did happen or didn't happen. There's no one who suffers. There's no one who loses out. There's no one who's being exploited or disadvantaged by it. Says Rabbeinu Yonah, even then, a person should avoid falsehood. A person should uphold truth. And the reason is pretty straightforward. He says, because otherwise a person will learn to lie. A person accustoms himself, like we say many times, hergel naaseh teva. Mesil Sisharim says that habits which become commonplace, which become part of a person's character, ultimately become imbued within his nature, whether for good or for better. And he quotes a Gemara, which I was in two minds whether I should read you this Gemara at length. I think I will. This passage has wider implications, but for our purposes, we're only interested in the lesson of how a person should not say an untruth, even for what may appear to be a valid reason. By the way, the Talmud elsewhere says that in 3 areas a person is allowed to tell what we would call a white lie, 3 specific areas, but it's not our subject for now. Rav's wife, the Gemara is in Yevamos, page 63b. Rav's wife used to torment him constantly. If he told her, prepare me lentils, she would prepare him beans. If he asked her for beans, she prepared him lentils. And apparently this went on for a long time. And Rav,
sorry, whose wife? Rob's wife. Rob.
Yeah, Rav, one of the sages of the Talmud. Oh. Yeah. No, it doesn't mean my wife, my friend. No, perish the thought. Yeah. One of the sages of the Talmud. When his son Chia grew up, he used to switch his father's instructions. So if Rav would say to his son Chia, who was maybe, let's say, an older, a teenager, young teenager, preteen even, if he would say to his son, tell Ima to make me lentils, or ask Ima to make us beans for tonight, so Chia would tell her the opposite. And by telling her the opposite, she would give him the opposite of what the son had requested on behalf of the father, and the father would get what he wanted. So Rav said to his son, your mother has improved. Rav remarked to his son, replied the son, I switched your orders and I tricked her into giving you what you really want. So Rav told him, now I understand what people say. You can learn something from your son, meaning this ploy hadn't occurred to me. But you should not continue to do this. That's the punchline, because it says they train their tongue to speak falsehood, striving to be iniquitous. Lamdu l'shonam l'shaker. This is a very bad habit to follow or to take on, that a person has to avoid saying something which is untrue. It says Rabbeinu Yonah, ala emes, the world stands on truth, even regarding something which is trivial, because a person can become accustomed to telling falsehoods, and ultimately it can lead to corruption and very negative consequences. To cast this same idea in a more positive light, there's the famous story of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky was one of the great Torah personalities of the 20th century. Excuse me. And he studied in Slobodka Yeshiva in Kovna, a suburb of Kovna, when he was a teenager. On one occasion, he wasn't able to go home for Pesach, and he was invited to the home, I think, of one of the Rosh Yeshiva in Slobodka Yeshiva, but he personally did not want to eat out on Pesach. There are some who have that personal stringency that they don't eat in other people's homes on Pesach. They only eat in their own home, or maybe family members, as a chumrah. But he was troubled by appearing to be more devout or more holy, more exacting than the distinguished Rosh Yeshiva who had invited him. And he didn't want to appear to be distrustful of the kosher standards of that distinguished rabbi. So he said, because they were in Lithuania, in Lithuanian circles, so there's no, generally speaking, Litvaks are not exacting or are not troubled about what's called gebraks. Gebraks is where matzah or matzah meal is mixed with water. So like matzah balls, or even anything made from matzah meal, they don't, those who, that's called gebraks, or in Hebrew called shruya, and Hasidim and some others don't eat matzah shruya. It's a chumrah which is of doubtful validity, to tell you the truth. The halachic sources struggle to find any justification for that stringency, but it actually has become quite widespread. Anyway, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, even as a boy, was invited to eat at this by Rosh Hashiva, and he didn't want to, but he didn't want to cast aspersions, so he said, "Ich ess nicht gebraks." My minhag is I don't eat gebraks. I don't eat matzah which has been mixed with water, and I know that you do, so therefore I won't eat in your home. And that way, he wasn't insulting anyone. It's just a matter of personal minhag. From the time that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, as a boy, as a teenager, said "Ich ess nicht gebraks," he never again ate gebraks on Pesach, because since he had fallen back on that turn of phrase as a way of getting out of the invitation without insulting anyone, because those words had left his mouth, from that time onward, he undertook never to eat gebraks, and he never has. I'm not sure whether his family and descendants do or don't, because according to the story that I've just said, which is quite a well-known story, he only undertook not to eat gebraks because he used that turn of phrase. So this is what Rabbeinu Yonah says about al ha'emes, not to accustom oneself to a falsehood, even with regard to a trivial matter. And he adds also, sorry, about shalom, the importance of peace. He says something which we can all appreciate, that peace encompasses kol tuv sheba'olam. Everything which is beneficial in the world is encompassed within the concept of peace. As the Mishnah says at the very end of the Mishnayos, the last Mishnah in all of the Shas is the Mishnah in Uktzin. As it happens, we mentioned it recently as well, last week I think, and it says, "Lo matzah kadosh baruch hu kli machzik bracha ela hashalom." The Almighty found no more inclusive principle to embrace all blessing than peace. We have it in this coming week's parsha as well, in Birchas Kohanim, v'yasim lecha shalom, after Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, after a number of very inspiring blessings. The last words are v'yasim lecha shalom. And this is why when we say the Amidah, the last bracha of the Amidah, of the 18 blessings, or even 19, is Hamavarech Hasamo Yisrael B'Shalom. Shalom is the vessel which encompasses all blessing, and in its absence, then no blessing can be appreciated or can be enjoyed if a person is lacking peace in his life. And Avadia Mibar Tanura, one of the classic commentaries on the Mishnah, says that this refers, when Rabban Shimon Gamliel says the world stands on three things, and shalom is one of them, he says explicitly, shalom b'malchios means peace among nations, peace in the military or political arena, and also peace between a person and those close to him. It means peace in my own life as well as peace in the wider society and in the world at large. This is a pillar upon which the earth, upon which the world endures. Now I want to tell you something which you may have heard before. It's a pleasure, I find, when an idea or a Torah thought, which possibly is quite well known, when I find it in print, when I find it in a classic source, even if maybe it derives from other similar sources, but it's always very satisfying to have that. So the Medrash Shmuel quotes the Rav Shimon Rashbatz, that's Rav Shimon ben Tzemach Duran. Very interesting personality. Now's not the time to discuss him in detail. He fled the massacres in Spain in 1391, and he went to Algeria, and he lived out about the second half of his life in Algeria. He was a very distinguished Torah scholar. He very diverse as well. He wrote in halacha. You may have heard of Tashbatz. He's quoted by all the halachic authorities for his responsa. Also wrote about philosophy, polemics, parshanut, as we shall see right now. So he wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avot called Magen Avot, and Medrash Shmuel quotes him as follows. He says, this word emes is a great word beyond the concept, which is so important, but even the word itself teaches us about its own importance. Take a look at the word emes. I hope you have a text in front of you. If not, you can imagine in your own mind the letters emes, aleph, mem, and taf. So he says that the aleph stands on two legs. It's supported on the margin. It's supported on the line on which it's written. The mem also has a broad base, and the taf has two legs. So ms stands strong. What about sheker? Sheker, if we think about it, shin kuf reish, so the shin is suspended on a point. The shin is suspended on a point. The reish has only one, the kuf has only one leg, and the other line of it is suspended in the air, and the reish has only one leg. So sheker can topple over easily. The Talmud says, kushta koi, that truth endures, stands, sheker enokoi, but sheker does not. Sheker collapses. So he says that ms, we can see the stability of truth, but the opposite of truth, which is sheker, topples over. But he adds that if sheker is turned upside down, the shin, which is turned upside down, it stands on three legs, very well supported. The kuf, if you turn it upside down, it's got a base to support it, and the reish as well. So sheker, which is reversed, which is turned on its head, which is ms, will stand very well. But sheker, as it exists as falsehood, will topple over. So that's why it says, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam kayam, the world will endure with ms, but with sheker, which is the opposite, it won't endure. It's also been pointed out that the word ms consists of three letters that are at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the alphabet. Aleph is the first letter, Taf is the last letter, Mem is the middle letter. So it's diverse, its portfolio is diversified, as our financial advisors would recommend. MS spreads throughout the alphabet. It's also been observed that MS is, Aleph Mem is aim. Aim means mother. It also means womb. W-O-M-B, womb, and the second two letters, if you look at the middle and the final letter, you have mace, which means death. So ms, truth, should accompany a person from the womb until the grave. So this is ms. Sheker, the letters of sheker appear at the end of the alphabet right next to one another. They're easily toppled over, as we've said. Okay, I've just elaborated a little bit further on what the Tashbats says, as is quoted in the Medrash Shmuel. Just want to mention our time is nearly up, but I've got a little bit more to share with you. Bunim has a nice little remez as well. He says that early in the Torah, in the creation account, the Torah says, Hashem says to declares, Totzi haaretz deshe, the earth should yield grass. Grass is part of the vegetation. Totzi haaretz deshe. So deshe is Daled Shin Aleph. It stands for Din Shalom Emes. Totzi haaretz deshe, that as if to say that woven into the fabric of creation, we have these three, the remes to these three. He also suggests another place where we find the word deshe for those who sing Mizmor LeDavid at Surah Shishit or other times. Psalm 23, one of the most famous chapters in Tehillim 23. Hashem roi lo echsar, Binaos deshe yarbitzeni, binaos deshe yarbitzeni, that Hashem causes me to find comfort or tranquility. Al memenuchos yinahaleni, he will lead me on still waters. So binaos deshe yarbitzeni, binaos deshe, again the same remes to these three, that when one has, when society has peace, justice, and truth, then things will go well. Time is nearly up, but I hope you don't mind if I take a couple of minutes more of your time. I may have to, okay, I'll be brief. Kerem Hatzvi finally takes up the elephant in the room. And for me, the elephant in the room is the temptation to prioritize peace over everything else. And there is such a temptation, because we've been praising peace. We've been explaining how peace is so instrumental, so essential. Says Rav Tzvi Hirsch Farber, yes, peace is extremely important, but it can only be valid if it's built upon the foundation of justice and truth. And he says that he must have been writing just after World War II, because he says that the nations of the world have promised us peace. He says, and yet they have allowed Nazi war criminals to escape, uh, uh, whether to South America or elsewhere, to escape justice. Yes, a few were executed at Nuremberg, but how many hundreds and even thousands were there who were allowed to go free? He says they never were called to account for their terrible crimes. And he mentions the land of Israel as well, what was then Palestine. He must have written it, as I said, just around the time after in the years immediately after the World War II. He says Britain had promised the Jewish people a homeland, a state in their own homeland. He said, and yet the British betrayal. He says, where's the emes? There's no din against the Nazis. There's no emes. There's a British betrayal in the land of Israel. He says every day Jewish blood is shed. He said, where's the emes? And then finally, he finishes his short but sharp diatribe by saying, and what about the Balabatim who coerce or pressure the rabbi to only speak about peace? When he gets up to give his oration, he can only speak about peace and about peaceful matters. Don't tell them about judgment. Don't tell them about the truth. He says this is corrupt. He says a rabbi who can't speak about din and can't speak about emes, he can only speak about shalom. He says this is the corruption of Britain. I've mentioned to you in the past that he was quite frustrated as a rabbi, probably unappreciated, and in a way, I guess it was mutual, because he, in some cases, didn't appreciate the pressure from his Balabatim very much either. Just want to end with a story. Rabbi Pinto, in his commentary, says that this exhortation is directed to the Torah scholars, the exhortation of our Mishnah that the world endures through truth, through justice, and through peace, is an exhortation to the Torah scholars to engage with the wider society, to not content themselves only with the study of Torah for their own spiritual growth. Not that he's criticizing that enterprise, but he says they have to also be involved with Yeshuvu Shel Olam, with assisting and advancing the world itself and the society itself. He says they have to seek to bring about justice. They have to provide, Torah teachings as well to the wider society, and they have to promote peace as well. And I'd like to just end with a story of Rav Moshe Feinstein, one of the great Torah figures. I'm sure you've heard his name, of the 20th century, died in 1986. I did have the privilege to meet Rav Moshe Feinstein on a few occasions, and he is without question among the greatest Torah figures of the 20th century for certain. Rav Moshe Feinstein's had the weight of the Jewish world on his frail shoulders, and yet he was very well known for having time for all people. How he did it, to be honest, I genuinely don't know, but I just want to end with one last story, beautiful story. It happened in 1969. A couple were married in Brooklyn, or probably Lower Manhattan. Excuse me. It must have been on a Sunday in the summer, and the wedding hall was doing brisk business, and they had another wedding for the evening, and therefore these people who were married had to vacate the hall by 5 o'clock. So I don't know what time the wedding started, but anyway, they wrapped up by whatever time. And naturally, the chassan and kala, their parents, were the last ones out, and they got all the things together, wedding gifts and everything else, and they packed it up. And the young couple had a car, and the girl's parents, who lived in Washington Heights, did not have a car. So the young just married couple, took her parents home to Washington Heights from downtown Manhattan, a journey of some miles. Anyway, they were spending the night in a hotel, with a wedding night. They got back to their hotel room probably a few hours later, and they realized they were unpacking their belongings. They couldn't find the ksuba that he had given to her under the chuppah only a few hours before. Couldn't find it. This is not just a matter of the sort of symbolism and the romance of it, but this is a halachic matter as well, because they're not allowed to share the same household. They're not allowed to live together in any sense of the term without a ksuba. even though they're married according to Torah law, but the ksuba is an essential feature. If they don't know where it is, she doesn't have to have it in her hand the whole time, but she has to know where it is. It belongs to her. If she has lost it or doesn't know who has it or where it is, they can't remain together. And we're talking, they've only been married a few hours, not a propitious way to get the marriage underway. Anyway, they called her parents in Washington Heights. They'd taken him from the car inadvertently. They looked through all their belongings. They didn't have it. The parents didn't have it. They called the wedding hall, and according to the story, the people were very helpful, very attentive. They looked through the kitchen, they looked through the laundry, they went even through the rubbish that had been discarded. Maybe someone inadvertently threw it out. Anyway, they couldn't find it. By this time, it was quite late at night, and the anxiety and the humiliation was intense. Anyway, the young man said to his new bride, he said, we're deep in trouble. I'm going to call Rav Moshe Feinstein. Where else can we turn? So he picked up the phone. He called Rav Moshe Feinstein and he told him his problems. Anyway, Moshe Feinstein said, "Don't worry, it will be fine." The couple went down to the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and they sat with Moshe Feinstein. He said, "I'll write up a new ksuba," and he wrote up a new ksuba for them. They came in, and his secretary was there. Moshe's attendant was there. The two of them witnessed the ksuba, and they wished Mazel Tov. And there are three of them, Rav Moshe Feinstein and his attendant and the young chassan. They got up and they danced around. The Rebbitzin brought out a l'chaim, and they had some tea. Said Mazel Tov in your wedding. Years later, this man said, at the time, it was the most humiliating, catastrophic way to begin my wedding. He said, but in retrospect, I'm so glad that we lost that ksuba. Gave me the chance to have an unforgettable, once-in-a-lifetime experience to see the chesed of Rav Moshe Feinstein, the way he put me at ease, the way that he arranged to even celebrate and rejoice in the fact that he was writing up a new ksuba for me. And he said, this is he didn't say it, but I'm saying this is the way of a gadol b'Torah, someone who is genuinely great in Torah, and this is the fulfillment of the three things upon which the world stands: on truth, on justice, and on shalom. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a wonderful week.